When I was 20, I had just moved to a new city, chasing the thrill of independence with my first real job at a local credit union. It was my first time living alone, and I'd barely unpacked the essentials before life started throwing its curveballs. Fresh from a small town an hour away, I wasn't used to city habits. One of those? Locking doors. Back home, doors only got locked at night, if then. That habit would soon haunt me. I was a smoker back then, not indoors though, because I hated the smell lingering inside. So every time I wanted a cigarette, I'd step out onto my tiny, fenced-in patio. For weeks, I'd lazily toss my cigarette butts into the grass until a stern note appeared on my door, courtesy of the property manager. Embarrassed, I grabbed a coffee can and made that my new ashtray, promising myself I'd do better. The weather that week was uncharacteristically warm for fall. I'd taken the day off to tackle a mountain of chores. The apartment hummed with the sound of my old radio, and I felt a rare peace settle over me. Around noon, I went out for a quick smoke break, enjoying the sun on my face before heading back in to switch the laundry. I just started a new load when I turned the corner into my living room and froze mid-step. A man was standing there. He looked average, normal even, except for the wild look in his eyes and the unnatural grin that stretched across his face. He didn't say anything. He didn't move, just stood there with his gaze locked on me. But the detail that made my blood run cold was that his pants were sagging around his ankles. Every muscle in my body tensed, and for a moment I was too stunned to react. The man finally shifted, taking a small, deliberate step toward me. It broke my paralysis, and I let out a scream so loud it felt like it could shatter the glass windows behind him. The grin faltered as panic flickered across his face. I screamed again, backing up as far as I could. That was it. He turned on his heel, yanked his pants up, and bolted out the patio door he had left ajar. I slammed it shut and locked it with trembling hands. My legs gave out and I sank onto the couch, shaking so badly that the phone fell from my grasp twice before I managed to call the police. The officers were calm, assuring me it was likely a failed break-in. They took my statement and promised to patrol the area more frequently. I didn't expect anything to come of it. Cases like that rarely do. But a few days later, they returned, this time with a detective and a stack of mugshots. When I reached the middle of the pile, my heart stuttered. There he was, that unnerving grin staring back at me in a grainy photo. "He's been in trouble before," the detective said, almost casually. "You were lucky. Really lucky." The man was arrested within a month on unrelated charges. This time, he took a plea deal and would be out in less than a year. But I didn't let fear have the last word. I locked every door and window religiously and learned to pay attention to my surroundings. And as a side effect of my new reluctance to linger on the patio alone, I quit smoking within a few weeks. I'm thankful for the lessons that came from that day, even if they were born out of terror. To this day, I don't leave a door unlocked for even a second. You never know who might be watching, waiting for that one lapse in judgment. Living in a town of just 300 people had its perks: peaceful mornings, neighbors who mostly kept to themselves, and the serene expanse of countryside. My house sat on the outskirts, with a large field that stretched out back, bordered by a thick line of trees. Most nights, you could hear nothing but the occasional hoot of an owl or the soft rustle of leaves. October 2019, however, brought more than the usual autumn chill. One evening, around 9 p.m., I was sprawled on my bed, scrolling through my phone with the blinds wide open. There was nothing out back to worry about, just the dark field and that one lone tree a little too close to the house. The first tap on the window barely registered. I assumed it was a branch or a stray acorn falling. The week had been exhausting, and I didn't need another thing to overthink. A few minutes later, tap. This time, it was sharper. My eyes darted to the window. I sat up, heart pounding a bit quicker now, and listened. Silence. My rational mind whispered it was just the wind, but another part of me shivered with unease. I decided that if it happened again, I'd take a look. Tap. I stood up, tugged on my hoodie, and approached the window cautiously. The moon was bright enough to cast long, deep shadows, making it hard to tell where shapes ended and darkness began. I stared out, straining my eyes, but saw nothing. Just that tree standing like a silent sentinel. I shook my head, feeling foolish, and turned to grab my phone from the bedside table. When I flicked on the flashlight and swept it across the yard, the beam illuminated the small outdoor table and chairs. Still nothing. I sighed and turned off the light. 2 nights later, it started again. This time while I was hunched over my laptop. Tap. My stomach tightened, the hair on my arms prickling, as I remembered the strange noises from before. I switched off my screen, plunging the room into near darkness, and moved silently to the window. A shadow shifted just beyond the tree. My chest tightened as I realized someone was standing out there, partially obscured by the branches. Suddenly, the figure moved, stepping out and throwing another small rock at the window, the tap sounding almost polite. I ducked away, heart hammering, and raced to the spare bedroom on the other side of the house. I didn't sleep a wink that night, ears straining for any sound. The next morning, I ventured outside, every step hesitant as if the earth itself might betray me. Near the fence, half hidden behind the tree, lay a backpack. My heart thudded as I unzipped it and found a mix of spray paint cans, body spray, and oddly enough, air fresheners. It felt like a bizarre prank, but the stakes felt higher than a simple joke. I dumped the bag in the trash and stayed vigilant. 2 more nights passed before I heard it again. Tap. I stayed rooted in my chair, refusing to move. Minutes stretched on, filled only with my ragged breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves. Finally, I dared a glance down the stairs and caught the shadow slipping over to my neighbor's house. They lingered near the bushes, almost blending in, before creeping closer to the side wall. What happened next? I wish I could tell you. I don't know if they were ever caught, or if they moved on to torment someone else. But from that week on, I kept my blinds closed and double-locked every door, haunted by the quiet taps that punctured my peaceful nights. It was Christmas Eve 2019, and I was alone in my college house. My 2 roommates were back with their families, leaving me as the sole occupant while I worked my shift in healthcare over the holidays. The house was just a 10-minute walk from campus, nestled in our quiet, familiar neighborhood. There had once been 4 of us, but one girl had moved out after a falling out. Her boyfriend was the problem, an arrogant guy who had abused our patience until we had no choice but to confront her. He was only supposed to visit occasionally, but he'd practically moved in, bringing chaos with him. After an explosive night involving him getting physical with her and hurling verbal abuse at the rest of us, we demanded she kick him out or we'd go to the landlord. Instead, she left on bad terms. Fast forward to Christmas Eve. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and went downstairs to my basement bedroom. It was past midnight, technically Christmas Day, and I was half asleep, scrolling mindlessly on my phone. That's when I heard it. The scrape of a chair moving across the kitchen floor. The kitchen was right above my room, and at first, I thought it was just the neighbors. The walls were thin, and their holiday celebrations were occasionally loud. But then I remembered. They weren't home. They'd asked me to grab a package if it arrived while they were away. The noise was brief and stopped as suddenly as it started, so I tried to brush it off. But then, the slow creak of my bedroom door opening made my heart leap into my throat. My 2nd grade teacher's voice floated back to me from years ago, recounting how she once pretended to be asleep during a robbery to avoid drawing attention. I wanted to mimic that calm, but my phone screen betrayed me, casting my terrified expression in a glowing spotlight. The door was barely cracked, but I could see him, a man with 1 foot over the threshold. We stared at each other, both frozen. I couldn't make out much in the darkness, just the glint of a backward baseball cap. Time stretched and twisted, seconds feeling like hours. Then slowly he pulled back, shutting the door quietly behind him. I lay there, paralyzed by shock. My mind screamed to do something, anything, but fear held me pinned. What if he was still in the house, lurking in another room? I wanted to call the police but hesitated, irrationally worried about my parents getting an alert and panicking. Instead, I texted the guy I was dating. Some random guy just broke into my house and came into my room. His immediate reply jolted me to action. Call the police, now. I dialed 911, whispering my address into the phone. The dispatcher asked if I could unlock the front door for the officers, but I told her I couldn't move from my room. A few minutes later, flashlights cut through the darkness outside my window, and I heard the police banging on the front door, announcing their arrival. They found me still sitting on my bed, shivering. One officer stayed with me while two others swept the house, guns drawn, clearing each room with military precision. But there was no one. The back door was found unlocked, no signs of forced entry. When they asked, I insisted I had locked it before going to bed. Nothing was taken. No damage was done. The man had simply opened my door, stood there, and left. The mystery haunted me for days. I slept fitfully, checking every lock multiple times each night. The landlord refused to change the locks despite my pleading, so I wedged chairs under the handles as makeshift security. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but deep down, I'm sure it was my old roommate's boyfriend. Maybe he still had a key, or maybe he just wanted to scare me. I hope, whatever his intentions were that night, he never tries something like that again. I got a dog and a Ring doorbell after that, and I double-check every lock before I sleep, wherever I am. In 2019, I was living in what I thought was a pretty decent apartment complex. It wasn't anything luxurious, but it was home. Things started to get weird when I found my massive clay planter tipped over one morning. This planter was no joke. It weighed over 200 pounds with the soil and plants inside. Whoever had pushed it must have done so at night, taking advantage of the rare moments I wasn't home or deep asleep. It rattled me, but I shrugged it off as an odd prank or someone being reckless. Weeks passed without incident, and I almost forgot about the planter until one morning after hosting a quiet game night with friends. We hadn't been loud, and no one left the apartment. But when I stepped outside the next morning, the word "a-hole" was scratched deeply into my front door. The message felt personal, targeted. I reported it to the apartment office, hoping for reassurance, but got little more than a shrug and a promise to paint over it. My unease grew. I asked around the complex, hoping someone might have seen something. My neighbors were unhelpful. One even gave me an odd answer that made it seem like he was speaking on behalf of others, not just himself. It left a bad taste in my mouth, but I brushed it off. The door was repainted, and life continued, though I started to feel the prickly awareness of being watched. The turning point came after another casual get-together a month later. The next morning, one of my friends came back to my apartment, visibly upset. Someone had keyed curse words into his car overnight. I rushed out to find that his wasn't the only one. My car and a couple of others from the party had been vandalized. That's when my anxiety turned to anger. We called the police, who, without security footage or witnesses, could do nothing more than suggest we report it to our insurance companies. Then came the tire slashing. I woke up to panicked texts from my friends saying they'd all found their tires flattened overnight. I rushed outside and found a nail driven into my own rear tire. The apartment complex had been doing roofing work, and the ground was littered with shingles and nails. It could have been coincidental, sure, but by then, everything felt deliberate. That was my breaking point. I stormed into the leasing office the next day and informed them I was moving out. They tried to give me the usual runaround, hinting at penalties for breaking the lease, but I wasn't having it. I made it clear I would not back down from any legal challenge if it came to that. By the end of that week, I'd packed up and moved into a new place. Only after I settled into my new apartment did I fully grasp the potential danger I'd been in. Whoever was behind those acts of vandalism had been sending a clear message, and it was unsettling to think how far they might have gone had I stayed. The worst part? I still don't know who it was or why they targeted me. It's left me constantly checking my surroundings and feeling a gnawing sense of vulnerability. To this day, I wonder if moving was enough, or if whoever it was will find me again. I've debated whether buying a gun would help me feel safer, or just fuel my paranoia. Am I overreacting? Or am I right to think it's better to be prepared for whatever might come next? In 2017, I was 18, wrapping up what should have been my senior year of high school. Thanks to my bad habit of skipping assignments and spending more time fishing than studying, I was a couple of credits short and had to do another semester. My parents were disappointed, but by then, it was what it was. Summer came and went in a blur of lazy days and fishing trips, and when school started up again, I had one goal: get through it and graduate. Despite that goal, my habits hadn't really changed. Skipping school to fish was practically second nature, and one morning, I decided to indulge that itch. My friend Mark and I left home as if we were heading to class, but stopped at a donut shop instead, savoring our usual breakfast of donuts and coffee until the bell rang for first period. Then, we drove 30 miles out to our favorite fishing spot, a quiet pond known for catfish and huge crappie, the kind that could make a seasoned fisherman's jaw drop. That day was particularly good. Mark even landed 2 crappie that could have passed as dinner plates. We packed up just after noon, our cooler full, and headed back. By the time I reached my house, it was around 1:30. The place was quiet, normal for that time of day. My parents wouldn't be home until after 3:45, so I figured I had time to shower off the fish smell and grab some lunch. I stepped into my room and started changing when a sound stopped me cold. A light bang coming from my parents' bedroom. The hair on my arms stood up. The rational part of me told myself it was probably just a draft, but I couldn't shake the creeping feeling that something was wrong. Who's there? I called out, my voice wavering in the silence. Nothing. I strained to listen, my pulse thundering in my ears, and then I heard it. The scuff of feet on the carpet. I took a cautious step into the hallway and turned the corner. My heart plummeted as I saw a leg swing out of my parents' open window, followed by another. The last man out wore a black bandana over his face. Our eyes locked for just a heartbeat before I spun around and bolted out of the house, adrenaline kicking in. I raced across the yard to our neighbor's house and banged on the door, not stopping until Mrs. Johnson opened it, eyes wide with concern. I stammered out what happened, and she immediately called the police. They arrived within minutes, but, of course, the burglars were long gone by then. The officers combed through the house, asking questions and taking notes. There were no fingerprints, no real clues left behind. I had just enough time to shower and put on clean clothes before my parents got home. I knew I couldn't hide what happened, so I told them the truth. They were shocked, worried, and full of questions, but in their concern for my safety, they didn't think to ask why I'd been home early. That question came a few days later, and by then, I'd prepared an excuse about feeling sick and coming home early from school. It was shaky, but they bought it. The police never caught the guys who broke in, though I heard later about a man being arrested for a string of burglaries in the area. It was never confirmed if he was one of them. The memory of seeing that man's eyes stayed with me, and I struggled to sleep for weeks after, listening for the slightest sound. Not long after, I dropped out and got my GED. I went on to community college and, ironically, found work with a home security company after graduating. Installing security systems has been my job for a few years now, and every day I'm reminded why I do it. I believe in what I'm doing so much that I have a system in my own home. After what happened that day, I wouldn't feel safe without it. The thought of my own son ever experiencing what I did sends a chill down my spine. If you have kids, or even if you don't, I can't stress enough. Make sure your home is secure. Stay safe, everyone. It's been 12 days since the incident, and I still feel a mix of disbelief and gratitude. To give a bit of context, I'm a 23-year-old guy living in Colorado with my parents. After graduating last fall, I struck a deal with them. I'd take 6 months off before diving into the job market. With that time almost up, I've been indulging in some serious downtime, spending hours lounging in front of the TV. One particular afternoon, I was stretched out on the couch, half watching Netflix with the sliding glass door cracked open to let in the cool breeze. The countryside around our house is peaceful, with large fields and acres between neighbors. The only sounds were the occasional bird call and a faint buzz from a lawnmower somewhere off in the distance. I was just settling deeper into the cushions when a sharp tick followed by a thud interrupted my show. The noise came from the direction of the sliding door. Curious, I paused the TV and sat up. I noticed a small, perfectly round hole in the mesh of the screen door. My initial reaction was more confusion than alarm. I stood up to get a closer look and saw another hole, this one embedded in the side of the couch, just inches from where I had been lying. The distant hum of the lawnmower grew louder, and I jumped to what seemed like the most logical conclusion. Some debris must have been shot out from under the mower's blades and ricocheted its way to my screen door. Satisfied with this explanation, I went back to my show, brushing off the strange event. The next day, I was recounting the odd moment to my mom. She suggested we dig into the couch to see what had punched those holes. We went to the garage to grab a screwdriver, and within a minute, I'd pried the fabric apart enough to pull out the small object. It sat cold and metallic in my hand, a .22 caliber bullet. My heart dropped into my stomach. I showed my mom, who gasped, her face going pale. We exchanged a few stunned words before deciding to call the police. 2 officers arrived promptly, their expressions serious as I walked them through what happened. They took the bullet, sealed it as evidence, and peppered me with questions. I did my best to recall every detail. How I'd been lying on the couch, how I thought it was just a rock. By the time they left, they'd told us what they could. It was either a stray bullet from a neighbor's target practice, or in the worst case, a deliberate shot. The idea that someone might have intentionally aimed at me was too surreal and terrifying to dwell on, so we clung to the first explanation. The officers promised to follow up if anything turned up, but days passed, and the phone stayed silent. I couldn't take the waiting anymore, so I called the station a week later. One of the officers explained that their investigation hadn't yielded any solid leads. The most likely scenario was a negligent shooter, someone taking aim at targets on their property without considering where the bullets might land. It was unnerving, but a part of me wanted to accept that version and move on. I'm a pretty easygoing guy, without enemies or bitter exes to speak of. The idea that someone could want to harm me felt impossible, but the randomness of that bullet had changed how I saw everything. What if I hadn't paused my show when I did? What if I'd been leaning forward or shifted slightly on the couch? The what-ifs played on a loop in my mind. We ruled it an accident, and unless new evidence emerges, that's how it'll stay. But I can't shake the awareness of how fragile safety can be. To any gun owners reading this, please be mindful. Bullets can travel far beyond what you expect and land where they're least intended. It's strange how life can pivot from a lazy afternoon to a close brush with disaster. It's a reminder that even when we feel untouchable, life has its way of snapping us back to reality. Stay safe, everyone. The past few years have been a whirlwind, a mix of loss, uncertainty, and moments that have left a permanent mark on my life. Early in 2020, just as the world was turning upside down, I lost my grandma to pneumonia. Soon after, my aunt fell severely ill, teetering on the edge of life. It was a lot for me to handle at 23, but there was one constant that kept me going: faith. Faith and I met in middle school. From the moment we connected, it felt like the universe had paired us up. But our story wasn't easy. Our homes were miles apart, and her parents were strict, traditional. They didn't want her dating, so our only lifeline was the phone. We'd talk into the early hours, sometimes showing up at school on no sleep, somehow keeping our bond alive despite the distance. High school tested us. Her father bought a house even further away, moving Faith into a new school district. I thought it was the end, but Faith, true to her name, didn't let go. By then, we both had computers, and video calls became our everything. For 3 years, those pixelated late-night conversations were the only way we could be together. When the pandemic hit, our world paused, and in that strange stillness, we found our own way to thrive. School went online, her father returned to work, and we suddenly had uninterrupted time. It wasn't the same as being in person, though, and the longing built up. Then came the opportunity I'd been waiting for. A day when we could finally see each other alone. I borrowed my brother's car and drove the 35 miles to her house. When she opened the door, we held each other like we'd been starved of touch, letting the moments stretch as we breathed in each other's presence. Things felt awkward at first, but that melted away as we laughed and talked like old times. We retreated to her room, stealing time together that felt like stolen treasure. Then, just as I'd stepped out of her room and she was making us snacks in the kitchen, everything fell apart. The front door slammed open, and her father's voice roared through the house. "Where is my daughter? What did you do to her?" My blood ran cold. Faith ran out to calm him, but it was useless. He was too furious, eyes darting between the two of us like a predator. He looked me up and down, and I could see the realization clicking in his eyes, the understanding of what our relationship meant. "What have you been up to?" he growled, and when silence stretched too long, he exploded. "Answer me." He lunged before I could react. His hand wrapped around my throat, lifting me off the ground. I gasped, struggling for air, fear clawing at my insides. "Listen to me," he spat. "I don't care if you've known each other since kindergarten. You leave now and don't come back. If I see you again, I'll kill you." He dropped me and I stumbled, barely registering the floor before his voice boomed. "Get out!" I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out the door, the engine roaring as I sped away, heart pounding in my chest. Miles later, I slowed, shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. My phone buzzed endlessly, Faith, calling, texting, but I couldn't bear to answer. At home, I locked myself in my room, trying to quiet the storm in my head. When I finally looked at my phone hours later, her messages were there, desperate, apologetic, full of love. But her father's threat was louder in my mind, and I knew I couldn't risk it. Talking to my brother, he advised me to take a night to think. That night was restless, and by morning, the trauma of it all hit harder. The image of her father's face wouldn't leave me, the suffocating weight of his words pressing down. I believed him when he said he'd kill me. It's been almost 3 years, and I haven't spoken to Faith since. She still texts sometimes, messages I read but don't answer. I can't. As long as she's under that roof, I can't risk it. I love her, always will, but the fear runs deep. Her father's rage isn't something I'll forget. Faith, if you read this, know that I love you. But until you're free from him, we're trapped, separated by the shadow of his anger. A heart broken in two, forever waiting.